Okay, this presentation is called 8 Ways to Approach the Existence of God, and this presentation was done at our apologetics ministry at The Ohio State University in fall of this year. Now, I'm not going to lay out several arguments for the existence of God. I'm just going to give an overview of the different ways people think about the God question or the different ways they approach the existence of God, because everybody's different. And of course, not everybody takes the exact same approach when they think about the God question. So that's what we're going to talk about in this presentation. Now, there's no doubt that if you have conversations with anybody on a college campus or just in general in life, you may hear these common objections such as, there's no proof for God, there's no evidence for God, or maybe we just can't know if there's a God or that Jesus is a son of God, or maybe we just don't know how to approach the existence of God. Some people might just say, I just don't know, and I don't know if I can know. So these are some of the common objections we hear on a regular basis. We have to remember when it comes to talking about proving the existence of God that there's always a difference between proofs and persuasion. Whether people will find something to be a proof sometimes depends on several factors or many factors, such as their presuppositions, their starting points when they think about the question, their worldview, which is how they view the world around them, and their ability, of course, to understand the argument. And persuasion's more subjective. Remember, everybody has access to the same evidence, the same proof. We'll talk about that as we go on here, but certainly persuasion's a little different. That involves a little more subjectivity. It involves your emotion, involves your will. And not everybody, of course, is persuaded by the same arguments, because if they were, everybody would probably be a theist. So that's just not the way life works. You know, everybody has different life circumstances. They take in their background beliefs. They take in a lot of factors when they think about the God question. Sometimes it's good to clarify what proof is. Some people think a proof means they need to have exhaustive certainty or mathematical certainty or absolute certainty with no possible alternative explanations for the existence of God or who Jesus is. Or maybe they just need to have every question or gap of knowledge filled in. Not everybody does this, but some people, the way they throw around the words proof and evidence, it kind of sounds that way even though they don't say it. So we just need to clarify what they mean by proof. Now, when it comes to logic or proof, generally we talk about things such as deductive proofs or inductive proofs or abductive proofs. If you study like logic in an introductory way, you know that you learn about deductive arguments, inductive arguments, and possibly abductive arguments. We're going to talk about some of these things as we go on here, but generally when someone brings up the word proof, I sometimes ask them if they know the difference between these three things, because deductive logic is certainly an a priori thing, and that's something that is like mathematical truths or things that are prior to experience or observation. And of course, inductive logic or induction is based on observation, experience, and that's where you get into the sciences and history, things that we observe or things that we experience. And that's really only going to probably provide a probable belief. It's only going to reach some kind of probability level. And then abductive proofs or abductive logic, or what we call inference the best explanation, is where it is kind of similar to induction, because you are observing something in reality, and then you're trying to come up with the best explanation for that feature of reality. So that wouldn't be deductive as well. And that's why when you look at this chart here, sometimes when people bring up these comments, you sometimes can respond. You know, when they say like there's no proof or evidence for God's existence, you can ask clarifying questions. You know, what do you mean by proof or evidence? Of course, you could ask, does proof or evidence mean to have no possible counter-arguments and have 100% certainty? I'm down on the left side here on the chart, depending on which way you're looking at it. Or does proof or evidence mean to have certitude? That means that you have no doubts whatsoever. Or does it mean to have exhaustive knowledge? Now, sometimes what I say to people is that when they, on the very bottom here, I say on the corner, I say, you know, when you get married or take a job or you make a big commitment in life, in many cases you do have some gaps of knowledge and some unanswered questions, but for some reason you're able to make a commitment in those areas. Of course, you have to make a commitment. And it seems like with the God question, people like to kind of stay in agnostic land and they don't want to commit. And so we just need to remind them that in many instances in life, they don't have all the questions answered exhaustively, but they still commit. And then on the right side here, we talk a little bit again about what induction is and deduction and abduction. But remember on the bottom right here, we talk about direct evidence and circumstantial or indirect evidence. There's really two kinds of evidences. There's direct and indirect. Many things in history and science, of course, are indirect because we weren't there to observe them directly. We didn't experience the Big Bang. We didn't see how life got started. We didn't see how the universe got going. There's so many things we did not see in history in the past, or things in antiquity. And so we can only offer circumstantial or indirect evidence. And that's fine. Some people are uncomfortable with that. They think we have to have direct evidence for everything, but life just doesn't work that way. So you just want to clarify some of these terms with them, and maybe that'll help them think about these issues. So I would say we can provide reasons or evidence for why Christian or theism is true, but maybe you just want to say we can give pointers to God. That's just maybe a word that kind of nuances it a little better. Many people, of course, as I said, have access to the same information, but may come to different conclusions. And of course, people reject our faith, not only because of intellectual reasons, but because of emotional or volitional reasons. Volitional reasons are their will, meaning that they do not want to commit to the belief. So just have to remind people that they are multifaceted, they're wired holistically. People have intellect, emotion, and will. And nobody comes into the God question with strictly rejecting it on intellect alone. I've been doing this for too long, and I know that that is not the case. So let's talk about some of the different ways people approach the existence of God. Well, first thing we have to clarify is that a lot of people will look at things like this in reality, such as a car or house or a table or just about anything around them. And they probably will notice that they can see that that has a physical structure. There's parts to it. It was put together by a designer, an architect, or a builder, or someone in a factory. Of course, you can verify the shape and composition of these things. And it's obvious that the majority of things we see in reality are like this. I mean, that's just the way it is. We can use our five senses to verify these things. So a lot of people think that God has to fit in this category, that he has to be a physical object. He has to be a thing, like an it, like he had to come from something else. He has to have physical or material parts. And that's part of the mistake they make in thinking about the God question. So we always have to remember the nature of the object determines how we know something. Of course, we looked at that table or car, we can verify what it is, its essence, its nature. We can see it has wood or it's metal or whatever it is. And with God's existence, we can't necessarily use our five senses. Now, some people think they've heard the voice of God. I'm aware of that. That's a question for another time. But we really can't smell God. We can't see God directly. We can't touch him directly. And we can't, in some cases, most cases, we can't hear God directly. I mean, just, depends how we define that, getting into the biblical issues. But we know that biblically God told Moses that no one can see him directly and live. We know that he said that, God is all consuming. And so no one can see him in his fullness directly or they won't live. Now, the point is that the only way we know what God is like, his nature, is if he shows us. If he might reveal that through the world of nature, he might pick a medium to show what he's like. And we'll talk about this as we go on. And of course, someone does not need to master philosophy, theology, and history and the sciences to have a relationship with God. A child can understand that God is real, and certainly who Jesus is. We all know people that have children that has happened. So let's talk about the traditional approach called the revelatory approach. This is probably the most common approach, where God has to take the initiative to show us what he's like. And of course, we know any relationship we have or anything we do generally takes communication, emails, texting, calling, whatever it is. The point is that no relationship is established unless one person takes the initiative to show what they're like to the other person. And this is kind of a similar theme in the Bible, that God has to take the initiative to show what he's like to humans because we're finite. And God sets the parameters as to how he will reveal himself to us. Of course, people in the Bible are dead, blinded, and bound to sin. We do not find God directly find what God is like unless he takes the initiative to reveal himself to us. So in the Bible, there's two kinds of revelation. There's what's called general revelation, because it's general because anyone can get it. It's available to the whole world. Of course, two mediums that God uses in the Bible, but people don't need the Bible to know this, are the world of nature, that they can look around the world and infer there is a creator. And of course, a moral law that's written in people's hearts. It transcends all cultures. They seem to have some common morality about some things are just right and wrong that transcend cultures. And so we'll talk about that more as we go along. Paul, of course, says in Romans 1:18-20 that God's existence and attributes are clearly seen, and they've been shown to the unbelieving world through the things that have been made. That means that people should be able to look at the features of reality or the effects in the world and infer there is a creator. Some people say they know it directly. They can look at a a rainbow or be on a hike somewhere and just suddenly seem to have a direct awareness that there is a creator. We'll talk about that as we go on. But of course, Paul says the unbeliever's problem is not one of perception, but reception, meaning that the unbeliever's problem is not one of understanding the truth of God, but a suppression, which leads to not receiving the truth. So God has already given knowledge of himself in the natural world, but people turn away from that because they do not want to be accountable to God. Of course, you have to read Romans 1 in its context, but that is just an overview of a little bit of what Paul's saying there. And then we believe, of course, that God reveals more of himself through the world of history. That means that God has decided to pick a text to show what he's like to us. He communicates through a written text. And in that text, we know that people had direct encounters with God. We know that God revealed himself to the nation of Israel. And of course, he did miracles in history where he showed what he was like at certain events, through certain events. And of course, prophecy is another thing in the Bible that reveals who God is. Jesus is the ultimate revelation of God. He shows what God is like. And of course, people can pick up the Bible and read about God's moral character attributes. They can find out what God is like. Of course, his metaphysical attributes as well, his omniscience, his omnipresence, and other things. But the point is that God has decided to communicate through a written text. Now, this presentation isn't on the historical reliability of the Bible compared to the Quran or some other revelatory text, or someone who claims to have another revelatory text. But the point is that God reveals himself through a text. And then finally, of course, he reveals himself through messengers, that he sends people to tell them about who Jesus is. Those are missionaries, or anyone's a missionary, of course, if you are a Christian. Another approach to the existence of God is seeing God as more of an explanatory hypothesis, or theism as an explanatory hypothesis. And what that means is something where this is kind of laid out in James Warner Wallace's book, God's Crime Scene, a very general book, but still has some, it's a great book. I'm just saying that if you want an introductory to this is in God's Crime Scene. And then Stephen Meyer will be talking about this in his upcoming book, The Return of the God Hypothesis. And this has to do more with what we talked about earlier, abductive arguments. And an abductive argument is not a deductive argument. It's more amplitative. And the conclusion goes beyond what is contained in the premises. And so abductive arguments are also called inferences to the best explanation. And what I mean by that is we all can observe some phenomenon or something in reality and look at the different ways it could have gotten there, and we try to come to a conclusion that explains it. And so we also, of course, believe this conclusion is the most plausible thing. It best fits with other theories. So when it comes to God as an hypothesis, is definitely dealing with abductive arguments. And as I said, this is called inference, the most reasonable explanation. So it's not that we can't agree on what needs to be explained, it's just why it is there, or how can we explain it. So we compare the evidence to potential explanations, determine which explanation was in fact the most reasonable inference in light of the evidence, and of course, the best explanation needs to cover all the data. For example, if you look at these questions here, these big questions like the origin of the universe, or how we explain the mathematical fine-tuning of the universe, or the why planet Earth is set up for life, or how life gets going, or the origin of mathematical laws and logic and physical natural laws, or the first cell, or things such as the origin of human reason, or human consciousness, or objective morality, or meaning or value in life, or purpose in life. These things are obviously heavily debated, and of course atheists and theists debate these all the time, but the point is that's when we're using God as an explanation. Now, of course, people try to throw in the God of the gaps argument, but that's not what really is going on there, because we do believe that God, of course, can be used as an explanation, but obviously philosophy can answer a lot of the why questions. Science only answers how the mechanisms work. It answers mostly the how questions. So there are other ways to explain reality other than science, as we'll talk about. But the point is that these questions are always out there and they're being debated. And so that is using God as an explanation there. And of course, we can look up many debates about this, but they're still being debated to this day. But that's just a way to approach the existence of God. And of course, when it comes to design arguments, those fall under some of those categories, as well as using God as an explanation for design. Now, some of those popular books have been written on these issues, such as Stephen Meyer's work or Doug Axe's work, or some other design authors writing on this topic are right here on the slide in front of you. You can pick those up. Some other ones, of course, Debating Design's a good book. I'm just going to say from my experiences that anytime you mention the words intelligent design, people scoff at it. But I find that a lot of people haven't even read the literature. They don't even know what they're talking about. So make sure you read books like Debating Design, where you have atheists and theists talking about the design arguments before you come to any conclusions. Now, one thing that comes up sometimes is that Christians, in many cases, will say everything is so complex. It's something they say sometimes, and people say, how do you know there's a God? And they'll say, well, everything's just so complex, like the universe is so complex or the world's so complex. I'm not sure if they really explain clearly what they mean here. I think we can kind of clarify it here with these 3 points. I think what most of the time we're trying to say that there's a specific object or event that they look at and they say, this looks like the result of a mind that planned ahead and thought had an end goal in mind, such as the universe or something in the world around us. It looks like it was a result of planning. It didn't happen by chance. Of course, chance isn't a cause. And it looks like it couldn't have been the result of unguided natural processes. That means that nature by itself, on its own, with no mind behind it, could not have come up with this. Couldn't have anticipated this and just done it on its own. And of course, also, I think we're saying a specific object or event can't be the result of chance or coincidence. There's deliberate designing behind it. There's a deliberate design behind it. There's a mind behind it that has planned this out. So I think that hopefully that'll help clarify when we talk about what it means to say everything's so complex. And of course, in the sciences today, on the right side, science is a study of natural causes or secondary causes, natural causation. It does not deal with primary causation or intelligent causation. Of course, you guys, or anybody that looks around the world, they know there's two kinds of causes. We see plenty of intelligent causation and natural causation, but the point is in science today, it's restricted to study natural causation alone. And then when it comes to the arguments for God as an explanatory hypothesis, of course, like I said, we're talking about inference, the best explanation. Now, C.S. Peirce, who was an American pragmatist and a philosopher, divided the inferences into 3 types: deductive, abductive, or inductive. We've talked about this a little bit, so we're talking about making inferences. Now, you might say to yourself, well, what's an inference? Well, you make inferences every day. We make inferences which are an idea or conclusion that's drawn from evidence and reasoning. Sometimes we make an educated guess about something, and sometimes we make a guess based on observation, background knowledge. So on a regular basis, we do make inferences. Sometimes we see things, we didn't see things directly, but obviously sometimes, we definitely will have to make an inference, and we need to know, definitely when we're ready to make an inference, but we make inferences all day long. So don't be surprised if you come along and make an inference today. Let's say you're driving down the street and you see an auto accident where someone's being taken away in a stretcher. You weren't there to see the accident, but you make the inference that there was a bad accident. Obviously, you make inferences all day long. Now let's talk about another design argument. For example, this is an inference, the best explanation as well in the fine-tuning of the universe argument. Of course, when it comes to fine-tuning argument, we're talking about the anthropic principle, which states the seemingly arbitrary and unrelated constants in the physics have one strange thing in common, namely that they all precisely have the same values needed for the universe to be capable of producing, supporting life. Some of the terms that are used in the fine-tuning argument are what's called constants. These are the set values that don't change, like gravity or electromagnetic force. The fine-tuning refers to the fact that constants and quantities in those formulas or laws of nature must fit an extraordinary narrow range to sustain life. And then life refers to anything that can take in food, extract energy from it, grow and adapt to its environment, and reproduce. So the fine-tuning argument has been heavily debated. There's been plenty of books written on this issue. We know that some of these books are right here. You can go deeper into it right here. Some of the most current books are the ones on the far right: The Fortunate Universe by Luke Barnes, Improbable Planet, which talks more about the fine-tuning of the planet, the kind of planet you have to get life going, and of course Signpost to God by Peter Busey. Some of the big defenders of the fine-tuning argument are Robin Collins and Luke Barnes. You can look at their videos, read about them online, their articles. Of course, they've debated atheists. They've handled a lot of skeptical objections. And so we need to be ready, and we need to know that certainly there are more than enough resources out there that can help deal with that issue. And I really encourage you to not be discouraged if someone comes up with an objection, because I have found that in many cases that these guys right here have dealt with those objections. So please research them heavily. Now let's give a little syllogism here, applying personal explanations to fine-tuning arguments. So remember, in science, science only studies impersonal laws. It does not allow personal explanations. That allows a mind. You're just talking about personal explanation, talking about a mind that thought ahead, that made a choice to bring an event to pass. So when it comes to fine-tuning argument, we're talking about advanced planning. We're talking about looks like there was a mind that set our universe up that planned ahead. So advanced planning, of course, is a sign of an intelligent cause. And we would say the whole universe shows evidence of advanced planning. And the conclusion is the whole universe was planned by intelligent cause or God. Now, we're not necessarily specifying as the God of the Bible, but the point is that the universe shows that it had to be set up ahead of time. And why would we need advanced planning? Well, if the universe is not set up the right way, then planet Earth is not set up for life. And in order to get life going, you need the right universe and you need the right planet. And so we would say an intelligent agent wanted sentient, self-aware, reasoning, personal creatures to exist. And if that's going to happen, they're going to have to plan that out. Now, you may say, well, what about other universes? Well, there isn't a lot of evidence for other universes yet. They're still looking at and talking about it. But if you want to point to the chance explanation, we just lucked out as one universe among many, and we were going to get it right. And fortunately, we got it right with us. You can say that as an explanation, but chance isn't a cause. And so one way or the other, I think that if you study this more clearly in a very careful way, you'll see that the amount of precision that's needed for our universe the way it's got to be set up has to be so precise for us to be here. And when people debate evolution, just remember when they jump to biological evolution, remember you have to have the right universe, the right planet, and you have to show how life can come from non-life before you even get to biological evolution. So that's helpful when talking to people when they say, well, evolution has disproved God. It's just nonsense. Now, some of these arguments were convincing to Antony Flew. He was the leading atheist philosopher in the 20th century. He became a deist around 2004 at age 81. As far as we know, he never became a Christian theist. But the point is that he thought some of the arguments and the design arguments, the cosmological arguments were good, were strong and compelling to him. And so that's one of the reasons he came out of his atheism and became some sort of deist or general, and a belief in some sort of general deity before he died. There's another argument in the design arguments called the information theory argument. Of course, this has been highlighted by Stephen Meyer and others. Thomas Woodward has a book here as well, studying the DNA here. When you think about DNA combines the biological instructions that make each species unique. DNA contains the instructions needed for an organism to develop, survive, and reproduce. To carry out these functions, the DNA sequences must be converted into messages that can be used to produce proteins, which are the complex molecules that do the work in our bodies. And enzymes need to read the information DNA molecule and to inscribe it into an intermediate molecule called messenger, which is RNA. Next, the information contained in the RNA is translated into the language of amino acids, which are the building blocks of proteins. And so basically, the DNA argument is really arguing for some kind of, it looks like a code, and this is talked about in the book Evolution 2.0 by Perry Marshall. This is kind of the way he sets up the argument. It says the sequence of DNA pairs in DNA is a code. Premise 2, all codes originate from a mind, therefore DNA originated from a mind. You can read his website right there. Of course, Stephen Meyer talks about this as well. But it's a very interesting argument, and I encourage you to study it more. Now, one thing that we do encounter a lot of times is people are not aware of the different kinds of causes out there. Some of these are talked about by Aristotle, but all these causes are based in reality. These are all around us. Of course, you have the material cause, you have the formal cause, you have the final cause, the instrumental cause, the efficient cause, and the sufficient cause. Now, you may say to yourself, well, this is so complicated, but believe it or not, many people do not recognize a lot of these causes because they're not aware of them. Now, there's no doubt when it comes to talking about arguments for the universe or design arguments who are dealing with these causes. And when it comes to science these days, they do not deal with efficient causation. It doesn't ask about the who behind what they observe because they don't study any kind of personal agency. And they generally don't deal with any final causation, which is the end goal or purpose, the why questions. So we'd have to punt to another way to look at reality other than science to answer those questions, and that's where philosophy comes into play. Now, another argument that's used in talking about God as an explanatory hypothesis, of course, is a moral argument, and this has to do with forming one's ethic. And of course, any ethical system will deal with moral values, moral duties, and moral accountability. These things are part of our reality every day, that we all have moral values such as love, justice, mercy. We also have moral duties, things we're obligated to do, those obligations. And of course, we believe in moral accountability. Now, this is a debated argument where we get into objective morality, we get into what's the best foundation or what's the most likely explanation for objective moral values and moral duties and moral accountability. A lot of these books have talked about this here. You can get any of these books. They've come out over the last 10 years or so, and they're very good. There's some more books here. One that came out most recently, The Morals of the Story, the blue one here, that came out last year. That's a very good overview. But the point is, of course, this argument is debated heavily, but the point is that the moral argument is another one that people use when talking about God as an explanatory hypothesis. Now, let's talk about another approach to talking about God's existence or the God question. That is called historical or evidential apologetics or history, looking at history. These are some resources right here you can read. And then we get in the issue of miracles, of course. We believe that God has shown up in history. He's not just a deistic God. We believe that if he created the universe, it would make sense that he'd want to reveal more of himself in history somewhere. Of course, we can debate where he has done this. Some people, or obviously Muslims, think he's done it through the Quran, but that's got problems, which we won't deal with right now. Or some people think it's through the Book of Mormon. And of course, we can give arguments why we think that God has spoken through the world of history in his relationship to Israel and how he brought Jesus into this world. And so this is something you can look at in these books right here. They deal with a lot of objections to miracles as well, some of the David Hume arguments and things like that. So it comes to historical argument. We're trying to show God is involved in world history, and we think that it's plausible that God would act in history and communicate to us through miracles, prophets, and a written text. And so this is kind of the syllogism we follow here, or the points. We set this up here. When we do historical apologetics, we're talking about history. We're trying to establish a New Testament documents or historically reliable evidence. Secondly, the historical evidence of the New Testament shows that Jesus is God incarnate. Of course, he's a Jewish Messiah, and God proved this through Jesus' teaching and claim to divinity by his miracles, his speaking authority, his resurrection. And if Jesus is God incarnate, Jesus taught the Old Testament is divinely inspired, and he promised the inspiration, New Testament, and the conclusion be the Bible is inspired. So that's something we do with the historical argument. Now, obviously, we also have to sometimes define what we mean by historically reliable. We say like the New Testament is historically reliable. Well, I think what we mean when we say historically reliable, we mean the events such as the people or the geographical locations are based on real, factual historical events. We also believe the text has been transmitted accurately. We also say you can trust the witnesses who wrote about the events, and we can trust the miracles in the New Testament. So, of course, that's a philosophical issue as well. But I think we need to clarify what we mean when we say historically reliable. There's plenty of books out there on the historical Jesus. Many books have been written about this, debated heavily, no doubt about that. And I highly recommend the book on the far right, The Gospel of the Lord by Michael Bird. I think that's an excellent book. These are all good books, but that's an excellent book. Came out over the last 4 or 5 years. And then when it comes to the resurrection of Jesus, this is Michael Licona's dissertation here. That's his book. Probably one of the most thorough defenses of Jesus' resurrection has been done in the last 20 years or so. So when it comes to the resurrection of Jesus, of course, nobody was there to observe it directly. We can't interview the witnesses. It's not based on direct evidence. It's based on indirect or circumstantial evidence. But the point is that we can talk about the best explanation for the event. And so when it comes to something like explanatory scope, we're talking about something that explains the data better than rival explanations. So, for example, whatever explanation we come up with to explain the data, we want to know what's the best explanation for the death of Jesus. There's not a lot of debate whether Jesus died, other than Muslims who don't agree, but most, even atheists, agree Jesus was a real figure who was crucified. But that's still one of the pieces of data we have to include in our list here. We need to come up with the best explanation for the appearances to the disciples, to the individuals and the groups after he died. Of course, what happened to Paul. We need to talk about the empty tomb, what happened to James. and how the early Jesus movement got off the ground and continued after the death of Jesus. And historians study causation. They want to know why new religious movements get started. They look at cause and effect relationships, and they look for the best explanation for that new movement that got started and kept going. And then, of course, why the early followers of Jesus began to worship Jesus. They changed their devotional practice. He was worshiped and honored and prayed to. And I would say it kind of goes like this as far as laying out the resurrection. If Jesus rose from the dead, therefore the God of the Bible exists. Premise 2, Jesus rose from the dead, therefore. The conclusion is the God of the Bible does exist, and it's not the same God as Zeus, Thor, or some other god out there like the flying spaghetti monster. And then the next syllogism would be, if the God of the Bible exists, you're not a naturalistic accident. Secondly, the God of the Bible exists. Therefore, you're not a naturalistic accident. So some people say, well, why does it matter if Jesus rose from the dead? That's something that I use sometimes just to talk about. Now, there's also plenty of resources on messianic prophecy. That's another way of looking at history, whether God has spoken through specific events where he's predicted things that would happen and come to pass. And of course, that's what we talk about when we talk about prophecy. These are some good books on that topic as well. And of course, in the book of Acts, we know that the primary way the apostles established the fact that Jesus was a Messiah was by appealing to prophecy. That was the way the faith spread in the first century. We don't do that as much today because a lot of Jewish people we talk to they don't even believe in God. But the audience in the first century, they were mostly Jewish theists, and they could appeal to prophecy. And so that's a good book, F.F. Bruce, A Defense of the Gospel in the New Testament. Now, another approach we take to talking about the existence of God is something that Alvin Plantinga talks about called properly basic beliefs. Alvin Plantinga is a well-known Christian philosopher. He really did a lot to help Christian philosophy gain more traction in academia. Plantinga says that a lot of our beliefs are not based on other beliefs. They're not inferred from other beliefs. Rather, they are starting points, such as we trust our senses, we believe our memories are reliable, and of course, we trust the testimony of others. And so for Plantinga, what he does, this talked about in this book here, Theology's Epistemological Dilemma, Plantinga takes issue with something what's called classical foundationalism, which requires that a belief be either basic, in which case it is either self-evident, incorrigible, or evident to the senses, or non-basic, in which case it is ultimately connected to basic beliefs by deduction, induction, or abduction. So Plantinga doesn't abandon foundationalism altogether, but he asks, why can't belief in God be properly basic? And so what he says is that, if people believe with evidence in other minds, or the past goes back more than 5 minutes and we had lunch, then why can't Christians believe in God on the same basis? And so he thinks that God has provided this mechanism of his awareness that is directed people, and it can kick in people's lives through their interaction with nature and their conscience or the moral law. And so he thinks that humans are born with a capacity that can trigger an awareness of God. But he says what makes this awareness evident to people may vary from one person to the other. So for Plantinga, people's encounter with the world can provide an immediate awareness of God. For example, if two people are hiking on a mountain, encountering the world of nature, they may simply know God exists. So for Plantinga, he thinks it's more intuitive, our belief in God's more intuitive than inferential, whereas we don't infer it from other beliefs. It's something that's direct. Of course, this is heavily debated. You can read some of the books on Plantinga or some of the critics, but of course he's responded. But just remember that's one way or another way people approach the existence of God. Of course, a similar approach may sound like it's very similar as experientialism. For a lot of Christians or a lot of people in religions, they have a transcendent experience or answered prayers or an awareness of God that is the basis for the conclusion there is a God who's real and in the world. Of course, many people claim to have a direct encounter with Jesus. Of course, biblically, we know the disciples of Jesus and anyone who comes to know Jesus are blessed to receive assurance of the faith through the work of the Holy Spirit. That's, of course, very subjective to some people, but for some people, that subjective experience and confirmation is very strong, and that gives them knowledge of God. And for some people, they experience God through the Holy Spirit and they read the Bible, or they experience Him in prayer. They experience Him when they share their faith. They see Him leading and guiding them. And the point is that for many people, religious experience is very powerful, and for them, that is one of the main reasons they think God is real. No doubt that that is not going away. It's been out there for a long time and still going to be out there for the years to come. Another approach to the existence of God are what's called existential arguments. And what that means is that some people are not necessarily logic and reason dominated, and they're more interested in emotional satisfaction. They have certain needs, emotional needs and existential needs, and it means that they think that emotions and psychological needs are just as legitimate approaches to looking for God. These things are talked about in Clifford Williams' book here, Existential Reasons for Belief in God, and then Greg Gansel's book, Our Deepest Desires. Some people might find this view of reality or kind of an atheist overview of how we got here to be existentially bankrupt. If you say, like number one here, that the laws of physics for our present universe arose by chance from a multitude of possible universes, the first forms of our life developed by chance arising from primordial combinations resulted from the laws of physics plus accidents, and the first concept of life developed purely by chance through genetic mutations, environmental randomness, and humans evolved by more improbable occurrences. Of course, this is a very general overview, but the point is that many people find this to be existentially bankrupt, and they just don't find any satisfaction in this at all. Now, you may say, well, that's the beans, that if it's true, it's true. There's good evidence for it. Of course, we can debate the evidence. That's what we do with evidential apologetics and some of the other things I've talked about. But the point is that some people obviously existentially do not connect with this. Just like Richard Dawkins' comment here, humans have always wondered about the meaning of life. Life has no higher purpose than to perpetuate the survival of DNA. Life has no design, no purpose, no evil, no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. So for Dawkins, obviously, when he makes that comment, some people read it and they say that is just not existentially satisfying. So, of course, like I said, we can debate the evidence as well, but that would be something that people do not find helps them define, or comments like this do not help them answer these questions. It doesn't fulfill the existential needs people have, such as the need for cosmic security, the need for meaning, the need to feel loved, the need to love others, the need for awe, the need to delight in goodness, the need to live beyond the grave, the need to be forgiven, and justice and fairness. Those comments by Dawkins and others just do not meet these needs. Now, another approach, existence of God, we've got a couple more here, are philosophical arguments, and this gets really a little more heady, but these books are helpful if you want to go deeper on this. There are philosophical reasons to believe in God, and some people don't think philosophy is useful at all, but I can tell you that if you read these books, they are very good, and I do think this is definitely a very important way to think about the God question. Some of these books by Edward Feser, some of the books he's written are helpful as well. His books, Five Proofs of the Existence of God or Last Superstition, are very good as well. And when it comes to thinking about the existence of God, as I talked a little bit about, natural theology is a practice of philosophically revealing the existence and nature of God independent of revealed theology, which is Scripture. And then revealed theology or history is based on authoritarianism. That's where we believe that God has revealed himself in history through a written text. And so most Christians sitting in churches, of course, are going to base their belief on authoritarianism. The pastor opens up the Bible, he preaches every week, they believe the Bible is the Word of God, it's an authority. But there are other ways to think about the existence of God other than a text. It's not that the text doesn't matter, but many people think that there are some other clues to God's existence other than the text. For example, when you look at the principle of sufficient reason, this is by Alexander Pruss, this says that everything exists has an explanation of its existence, either a necessity of its own nature or an external cause. Therefore, the universe either cause itself or has an external cause. So these are some of the terms that Feser uses and are used in some of these arguments, these philosophical arguments, just an overview quickly. When we talk about actuality, that means that which actually exists. Actuality is something that causes something to exist or causes something else to be modified or changed. Potentiality is that which can undergo change. Things with potentiality are dependent or contingent on something else. And of course, change is a movement from potentiality to actuality. Now, there's no doubt that things around us change all the time. There's things we observe that are in a state of potentiality, and they go from potentiality to actuality. So when we say in the bottom here that things change, we're saying a being and act causing change in another being cannot go backwards forever. Therefore, there must be a being that is not composed of act and potency, but is simply act. And this is what we believe is what's called God, or what we call the God, the argument for them from the philosophers. And so let's look at the contingency argument a little deeper here. We kind of gave some background there, some of the terms that are used. But it kind of goes like this. So all things in nature are subject to change. Number two, is possible for a thing not to be, then to come into existence and then cease to exist. The universe therefore would be contingent or dependent. If so, this is so, then at some time there was nothing at all. And if this is so, there must be something that brings contingent things into existence, and nothing can come from nothing. Therefore, there must be a being that does necessarily exist, not depend on other beings to bring the contingent world into being. This is what we call God. And that is a little background on the argument from contingency. And then finally, we wrap up with what's called personal testimony or pragmatic arguments. And this is where people really want to know if a belief works in everyday life. They want to know if it really makes a difference. I mean, does it have practical results? And so our culture is built on pragmatism. Government's built on pragmatism. We get an education which is built on pragmatism. You have to make decisions by things that get you results. They have practical outworking. So this course has legitimacy to it, but when it comes to looking at religious beliefs, some people might look at other Christians, or they might talk to other Christians, and they may say, hey, you know what? I saw Jesus work in your life. Maybe I'll try it. Maybe he'd work in my life too. I want to see the difference he makes. And so a lot of this has to do with a pragmatic outlook on religion. This is talked a lot by William James in his books. I think it was called Religious Experience. So you can look at that on your own time. This gets a little tricky because if I could just lay this out, let's say that you're a Mormon and or somebody you're trying to look into different religions, and you look at Mormonism. You say, you know what? I really like the way Mormons live. They're kind, they're generous. Seems like their Mormonism makes a big difference in their lives. Or you look at Islam and you say, you know what? I've watched Muslims in action. They seem to really believe what they believe. They live it out. It looks like it makes a practical difference. Well, if you're going to base a belief only on pragmatic benefit, that gets kind of tricky, because if you don't use a correspondence test, as I have at the top here, you could believe something that doesn't even correspond to reality. That means that you could believe something that isn't even based in reality, and believing that it just makes a difference in your life, even if it doesn't correspond to reality. Now, you may say, well, how's that possible? Well, something could have some pragmatic value to it, like Mormonism or Islam or something, or even atheism or something else. But that doesn't mean it's based in reality. So the first test you need to use in evaluating a belief system is whether the claim matches reality. Now, of course, you have to provide evidence to show matches in reality, but the point is that if you just jump to pragmatism, that can get kind of tricky. So it's not that pragmatic benefit doesn't matter, it's just that you can't use it as your first test for truth.